1939. The echoes of another world war rippled throughout the world to reach the ears of an eager young generation, ready to rise up for their nation. The patriotism for king and country had not tarnished in the years since the Great War. Excitement, adventure, and enthusiasm were tempered by the words of the previous generation, yet they remained steadfast, steeling their determination to give a good account of themselves in the coming battle. If Australia were to go to war, then in time-honoured tradition those battles would be fought on other shores to protect the island continent.
Well, it was a bit exciting, I suppose, in one respect, but being a young fella, like all the young fellas in those days, well, most of us, we were keen to probably do something.
The idea of it was, what I was told, that in Australia we'd fight battles on other continents. There's never been a war on this one.
On the other side of the world, the United Kingdom's struggle for survival had drawn to a close. The Battle of Britain had been fought and won, but with great sacrifice. England's tenacity had garnered a respect from those nations involved and those watching from the sidelines. It was this air war that saw the advent of a legend. The Supermarine Spitfire had earned a reputation as the elite fighter of the age. Thousands joined the Air Force for a chance to be in the cockpit of such a machine.
I'd been in the militia for 12 months. And I was very keen on service life, and always maintained that if we did have to go to war, I'd like to join the Air Force.
I was a plumber. I was working in Mawullumba at the time. One of my mates rang me to say he was joining the Air Force. And then I had another mate ring me too. He was joining the Air Force.
And I talked to my father, who wasn't too pleased about it, but he'd been an infantry sergeant in the First War, and he said, well, whatever you do, don't join the infantry. So I said, well, what about the Air Force? He said, all right.
It was always an ambition to be in the Air Force and to fly. My father had been in the Imperial Light Horse in South Africa in the First World War. He was experienced, he just said that, well, it's what your normal duty. Duty was a word used in those days.
Following the declaration of war, Mother England formed an agreement with the nations of the Commonwealth. The Empire Air Training Scheme was born on the 17th of December 1939. Australia agreed to provide 28,000 aircrew over 3 years to the training schools. The training of pilots was harsh and unforgiving, with many casualties before enemy action was experienced. As an instructor, Jim Tevlin was well aware of the quality of training that would become crucial to the young aircrew's survival over the coming years.
There's, at Mildura, there were 65 dead. To continue on that, there were 35 at Deniliquin. Most of them were trainees. But if you understand, we were flying them and telling them to fly at the limit.
Well, it was a wonderful training. I've often thought of the fact that, for instance, I don't know nowadays, not too many training pilots outside the military anyhow would even be allowed to spin. They might go into a partial spin, but in our case we not only learned to spin in the old Tiger Moth, we would do a complete spin and recovery under the hood and recover. And so you knew you were getting very good training, first class.
I went through the initial training course. More trouble than Ginger Megs I got into one another. I thought they were picking on me. So the drill instructors, I'm sure some of my friends will say the same thing. Drill instructors didn't have a great liking for 18-year-old cadets learning to be airmen, we'll put it that way.
The time to leave their island home had arrived. The young men were to embark on a journey into the unknown. For many it was their first time away from family, and for some the first time overseas. But for all, it was an uncertain future that loomed nearer.
Will got on board the ship for Britain, and as we left Sydney Harbour, I was at the rail and I said to myself, I wonder will I ever see these shores again.
Due to the efforts of the Hurricanes and Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, they became a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. Behind the propaganda, the machine was rising to legendary status amongst the aircrew.
Our preference was we wanted to be fighter pilots, we wanted to fly Spitfire, so we just hung in and hung in and hung in until eventually we were given our choice. After the Battle of Britain, it really got known as the aeroplane to fly.
The attraction of the Spitfire and its purity of flight bound together those who flew and maintained the machine. It was used in nearly all theatres of war, including the grassy English fields of its birth, the jungles of India, the Mediterranean fortress of Malta, the harsh deserts of Africa, to the scrub of Australia. The long months of intensive training were about to be brought to the fore. Squadron life had begun for these young men, all of them eager to prove their worth in operations to the more experienced flyers.
It's a whole new game. They're inclined to say when you go into a squadron, okay, everything you've learnt, forget it. We're going to teach you something, how to fly it now, how to really fly. And you do. The pressure's on.
We went into one of the worst winters that they'd had in Europe for several years. So it was the first time most of us had ever seen snow. And the Isle of Man, of course, is perched right in the middle of the Irish Sea and is windswept. And it was bitterly cold, and mud and slush was the order of the day. The most difficult part of it was working on aircraft under these conditions. It was all new, very, very new to us. But we survived.
Well, when I first there, I was a sprog, and they always put the sprogs on the outside of the formation. And if you survive 2 or 3 of those on the outside, you then later they call you operational. But you weren't operational over there until you'd done 3 or 4 shows, or you'd seen an angry man.
The war for the skies in Europe was still raging, though not as visible as the Battle of Britain. New pilots were tempered by the heat of operations, learning fast, if they survived. The ground crew faced the back-breaking work with steadfast strength, all the while looking on as the war continued on around them. Their way of fighting back against the savagery of the war was to keep the only weapon they had in the air, the Spitfire.
Yeah, well, they never got off the ground without us. And I mean, they had their work to do, or their job to do, as I had mine. And I think, without boasting, that I did a good job while I was there to keep them up. And they did a good job too, trying to keep alive or knock someone else down first and then get back again.
I thought they were fantastic, both 601 Squadron and 81 Squadron. And we used to get a beer ration, I think, once a month or whatever it was. Well, I used to always give mine to my ground crew. You had to look after them.
They were wonderful. Yeah. They looked after them very well. Obviously, they'd be out there to meet you when you were taxiing back in. Leap up on the wing, start undo gun panels and all that sort of business, getting ready for whatever was next required. They were really wonderful. You get little slips of girls' waifs, as they were then, coming out freezing cold with their little mittens on and their fingers all pink, almost blue, and they'd be climbing all over the aircraft, handing the freezing petrol and never whinging.
They were excellent. All the equipment worked. The only failings we really had were with ammunition, and that was not the fault of the armourers. A lot of the cannon shells had come from England and they weren't properly tropicalised. Once they grew out here, the They just couldn't cope. The ammunition didn't cope with the weather, and it was quite distracting if you had a hang-up in one cannon. You can imagine the cannon on, say, the port side stopped, the starboard one would go, and it was almost impossible to keep the aircraft straight if there was one cannon firing and the other one wasn't.
For the pilots, their world was a cold, cramped cockpit and a gun sight, with complete trust in the work of their ground crew, enabling them to concentrate on the job at hand.
I had complete faith in if my fitter 2E, the engine mechanic, said she's all ready and she's running all right, that was good enough for me.
The worth of the Spitfire was proven by the different types of operations it could engage in. The pilots then relied on their own skill and talents to bring themselves safely back with their aircraft.
But I was RZ Charlie, and I turned into these two Messerschmitts and given them a burst of fire and thought I'd better get out of here because I'd never catch up with the beehive. And I went into a vertical dive and I headed for Calais, where there was quite a heavy fog. I was weaving skid turns to keep my eye on these friends behind me, and they weren't catching up, and I got in the smog and went over the water in at Calais through the docks, and I did a flat skidding turn and to see if my friends were still after me, and I saw these two big splashes in the sea behind me, and I think they hadn't pulled out in time. They'd gone straight in.
All we thought about was, you got to shoot down. You're going to shoot down anything. You shoot down an aeroplane. We weren't shooting at men. We were shooting at aircraft. And that was, I think, the attitude of most of the pilots. You weren't worried about the enemy. You were worried about the aeroplane. The more of those you shot down, well, the better you were.
Well, I certainly had an occasion with meeting up with enemy aircraft, our squadron, and I shared one of the flight commanders damaged this Messerschmitt 210, twin-engine aircraft, and he, flew past and I was in behind him, and I shot it and got the other engine, and then the crew bailed out. And I flew around, but no way in the world would I press the trigger of the guns to shoot at the parachute or the individuals in the parachute. It was certainly, I think, a bond of something, even though you're trying to shoot the aircraft down, and you shot the aircraft down.
The charisma of the Spitfire, perpetuated by the media for the public, stayed with it. This bond between fighter pilots on opposing sides has been likened to chivalric knights dueling in the skies. Their noble steeds of stainless steel and aluminium clashing thousands of feet above the earth. The reality was of man and machine desperately trying to survive. And for those unlucky enough to be caught in the crosshairs of an enemy plane, the horror of war was soon brought home, as Fraser Jum Faulkner found out.
Anyhow, I saw 3 or 4 109s down below, a couple of thousand feet below me, and I thought, by gee, that's too good to miss. And we had a little lever on, near your throttle, you could flick to radio transmit, and I had a very good look round in the cockpit wing in the sun, and had a look round everything and behind me, and I was just about to say, Blue One, I'm going down, watch me tail, when I blew up. I was just sitting in this petrol fire, and which was right through the cabin. Luckily I undid my safety harness. I knew I'd have to get out, and then tried to open my canopy, which you had 2 levers. You just pulled it back and it should have slid open easily, but I think the heat had made the metal expand and it wouldn't budge. And then we had a safety thing like a small rubber ball up in the right-hand corner, which you could pull, and it was to pull the pins out of the canopy so it would fly off. But I think the heat of the flames had melted the rubber ball, and I was with my gauntlets and gloves trying to pull this, and I just had a piece of wire. And from then on, I don't know, I think I went unconscious through the flames and lack of oxygen, and I think the plane must have exploded and blown me up. Next thing I knew, I was lying completely relaxed with this strange whistling noise. It all came back and I said, God, I should be flying. I reached over and pulled my ripcord and plop. I looked down and saw French peasants not far below and hit the ground.
The loss of pilots to enemy action was a severe blow to the squadron's morale. Both fellow pilots and ground crew were affected. Yet they all pressed on. The war would not stop for anyone.
It was a moment of sadness for anybody in the squadron to lose one of your pilots. But your life had to go on. You couldn't brood about it. I don't know whether their comrades, the pilot comrades, whether they suffered more than we did. I would think the greatest sadness would fall on the commanding officer, who was responsible for everybody. I only lost one pilot, and that was in England. His name was Brian North, and he had a nickname, Knockers North, and he was a New Zealand ace, and we lost him in England. We used to listen in on the RT radios to the air battles that were going on, and we heard him sing out that he'd copped it and he was going down, and that's it, fellas, he said. Bye. Poor old North went in.
And you form a steadfastness in friendship, and the same with in the squadron. But you can't let it dwell, because you've got to get on with the next job.
While the skies were a perilous place to be during operations, it was more dangerous in London. The indiscriminate bombing of the capital meant that when servicemen went on leave there, it was at their own risk.
You could be wandering around London on leave, and it'd be more dangerous there than it would be down at Red Hill.
Even then, during those trying times, the Spitfire was the guardian of a nation, defending against the rocket-propelled missiles, the V-1 buzz bombs, and later taking the fight to the V-2 rocket sites.
In this case, we were carrying two 250-pound bombs, which is entirely out of character for a Spitfire, and a 45-gallon drop tank. And our mission was to go to a site just beside The Hague in Holland and drop the bombs and return to England. I can remember clearly now the first time seeing the white streak straight up through the sky of a V-2 rocket. And you know jolly well that that rocket's going to land in London indiscriminately, and there's a lot of people going to get hurt. So it starts to get very serious straight away. You wend your way across the water, and which is never very comforting on a fighter aircraft with a single engine, and you finally see the coast of Holland come into view. You get the nod from the CO to start your weaving, because the flak will start to range you, and you can actually see the hay coming into view, and almost within no time you'll see the actual target, as you've got the gantry of the V2 rocket and everything in what might be called like a football field. And our job, which was, I say, right out of character of the Spitfire, was you would range in over the target with the target slipping underneath the wing root of your wing, and you'd watch your CO, and up he'd go over on his back completely, and then straight down vertically, and immediately you'd go over and you'd follow him. And you'd have about, I'd reckon, 6, 7, 8 seconds between the time you roll on the back until the time you come out of the bottom. And you're going to be raking a pretty fast speed. And the aircraft's all heavy as lead with its bomb load. It's totally out of character for the dancing, very free and easy type of aircraft that it is. And you're just going vertically down, and you can see some of the white flak coming up at you, and you one of those going to be for me, but this is not the time to be thinking about it anyhow, so you haven't got the time, so it's straight down into the target. You can see your CO in front of you, probably only a few hundred feet ahead, and you see his bombs come off, and you think, right, line up in that target and get rid of yours, and I hope they both go. And as soon as it goes, the aircraft becomes immediately the fanciful type of aircraft. It's very, very fast, and anyhow, you pull out of the dive with a great amount of stress and strain on yourself. The mask falls down over your face, your eyes drop into your head, and it goes grey, and then finally it'll start to get very black until you're really then going vertical, and you heave back on the stick and you slam the throttle hard home to climb away. And next thing you know, you've got it all back and you're staring at the sun. And you're not quite sure where your bombs went, but you hope they've had some effect. You get to the bar after the debriefing at night, and you get back into your bunk and you start to play it all over again and again, and you think, gosh, I've got to do this again and again and again. And you wonder how long you're going to be able to manage to get away with that. At that time I was only 21, so you wonder whether you're going to make 22.
The European war had consumed countless lives, but their sacrifices were slowly turning the tide in the air. Hitler's armies of the sky were slowly being ground down. The Australians held their breath as the war reached their shores. The island continent had been attacked as Japanese forces encroached upon Australian waters. The port town of Darwin had suffered heavily under the onslaught of a large aerial assault. The incident on the 19th of February 1942 remains surrounded in controversy, with varying reports as to what occurred still surfacing. What is confirmed is that Australia was completely unprepared. The Japanese aircraft dropped their bombs on our homes, our streets, and the families of Darwin. It was these events that made times grim in Australia. The Japanese looked set to invade, and the reports of their atrocities were filtering through. Australia began to hurriedly recall some of the aircrew serving in England, to build up its defences using what resources it had on hand. A plea for help was sent to England.
Dr. H.V. Evatt went over to England and had a powwow with Churchill and convinced him that he should release some Spitfire squadrons, or fighter squadrons anyhow, to return to Australia to defend Australia against what they assumed would be an imminent attack. So while our squadron was at Red Hill in the middle of our tour of operations there, we were stood down and told we're going back to Australia, which we all thought was a jolly good idea, because everybody was sort of talking about it and worried about the folks at home and that sort of thing, and felt that we should be back there, not here.
RAAF 452 and 457 Spitfire squadrons would return home, along with RAF 54 Squadron. The Australians were elated to have the chance to defend their homeland with the elite Spitfire fighter aircraft. The Englishmen, however, were unaware of their destination.
I was posted up to Scotland with 54 Squadron, I didn't know, and within 2 weeks I was on the ship out to this country, on the Stirling Castle. We got as far as Durban, and we thought we came out to the Middle East because we had the taupe hats, but we weren't. The boat went all by itself across to Fremantle, and then on the way there they told us we're coming out to this country and we're bringing the Spits out with us.
We didn't get back into the thick of it immediately on our arrival back in Australia because the aircraft that were aboard the ship that we came back on and other ships were diverted to the Middle East campaign. The Alamein offensive was about to start and they wanted our aircraft for that, so they were taken off the ship at Freetown. So we had to cool our heels for about 2 or 3 months until another shipment came. They had to be assembled, and then we all went up to Darwin various ways.
The operational conditions of Darwin and the surrounding areas were a world away from what many of the men were used to, especially those of 54 Squadron.
We just live in a pair of shorts all day long. Live in a tent, get washed out from your tent. Yes, if you haven't lived in the tropics for 2 years solid, in a tent, you don't know what it's like up there. It was very, very primitive. The food all came out in cans and all that sort of thing. There was no fresh fruit.
Darwin was on the receiving end of 64 air raids by the Japanese forces, with the main targets being the township of Darwin itself and the bomber squadrons based in the surrounding areas. If it wasn't the threat of Japanese attack, with the airmen having to be on constant standby, the semi-tropical climate of Darwin did have an effect on the pilots, as Jeff Marsh soon found out when he joined 457 Squadron.
We were still doing standby duty. Sometimes you'd be sitting in the aircraft for an hour or two in case there was a scramble. It was very uncomfortable, it was hot, it was sticky and juicy. You can imagine sitting in a Spitfire cockpit for an hour. You were drenched in perspiration, which became a problem if you actually had to scramble, which we did a number of times. Once you got up to about 5,000 feet, all your clothing was saturated and you damn near froze because it got so cold, and it took some time for you to dry out.
The Darwin ground crew faced many problems in the tropics in maintaining the aircraft, from working in the intense heat and humidity and torrential monsoon downpours. The shortage of spare parts and mechanical flaws added to the difficulties experienced. For such instances, the ground crew could not be held at fault. Rather, the aircraft was being used in circumstances for which it had not been designed. For those overseas, the war continued. The Australians on foreign soil could only hope that their home, with friends and family, would be safe from attack. Many of the pilots were still serving with RAF squadrons. The call to return to Australia was given to a select few Spitfire pilots to replace casualties in Darwin.
222 Squadron had been a Battle of Britain squadron, and at the time when I joined it, they'd been at the Dieppe battles, and they were a bit strung out, and they'd gone to Scotland to build up their personnel and so forth. After a bit of time there, they said, oh, you're posted overseas. And I thought, oh yeah, I suppose that's the Middle East, which didn't make me feel too happy. But however, went to Embarkation Depot near Manchester and found a draft of Australian Spitfire pilots there. There would have been probably about 20 in all, we found out that we were all posted back to Australia, the idea of the posting was to be reinforcements for the Darwin wing.
After Dudley Grinlington and the contingent of Spitfire aircrew arrived in Australia, it was discovered that things had changed in regards to their orders.
It appeared that the Darwin Spitfires hadn't lost the pilots they expected, and in the meantime General Kenny had been worrying Air Vice Marshal Jones, the Chief of Air Staff. He wanted one of the Darwin Spitfire squadrons to go to New Guinea to protect his bombers which were coming back from Rabaul and being attacked by Zeros coming down from Lae. So they weren't going to break up the Darwin wing, but he got the idea of forming up a new Spitfire squadron.
And so, 79 Spitfire Squadron was born. It had its early beginnings at Woollamanata, at the foot of the You Yang Ranges, west of Melbourne. It was a small airstrip on a sheep property, and though the livestock had been relocated, it was soon to host other more aerodynamic wildlife. Jeff Wilkinson was the first pilot assigned to the unit.
Reported in, and the CO called Rawlinson from the Middle East was forming this new squadron, 79. I was the first pilot to arrive, so that's how I got back on Spitz. It was only just forming the squadron, and it was only out on a grass area, and we were just doing a little bit of flying, and we didn't have any aircraft to start with. And I remember one day the CO said, "We've got the brass coming down from Laverton. Will you take them down to the landing strip and show?" They went to have a look at it. And Wing Commander, our Air Commodore Wackett, arrived, and a couple of other group captains, and got the staff car, and I took them down. And our Tiger Moth, we had a Tiger Moth, and someone was in it. It was either Dave Hopton or the squadron doctor who could fly it, and they was diving down, fooling about. And Wackett said, "Who's that idiot?" He said. "What's his name?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, sir." "Well, you find out when he comes in, I want to see him." "What's he doing that for?" I said, "Oh, this place has got sheep on it, sir, and he's hunting the sheep out of the way before he lands." "Oh, that's very good, he said.
The first Spitfire to be assigned to the unit was A58-169, a Mark 5C. It was perfectly fitting for Jeff Wilkinson to bring it back to the squadron from one aircraft depot at Laverton. Chance, it seems, would have it otherwise.
I'm very ashamed of this, but the CO said they've got a Spitfire ready at Laverton. Would you, Dave will take home the Tiger Moth, and will you bring it back? Because you were the first pilot, I get to bring the Spit back. So I flew over to Laverton after lunch, and they said it's not ready yet. Wait around. Dave went back. They hung around late, time getting on and getting late. And finally they said she's right. So then it's starting to get dark, and I had to get back to Woollamanata. It was only about 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour. So away I went, and just getting dark, and I came and do a beautiful landing. I spent a bump underneath, and next minute I was on my nose. So that was a bit of embarrassment.
While not an auspicious start for the squadron, they were to enter operations in New Guinea. The next part of the journey was a series of stops along their way to Goodenough Island. The squadron had not even started operations when tragedy struck during the long trip.
We're going to Townsville, and on the way up, I came in with the second lot. First lot were ahead, and we told to land at Rockhampton. So we landed there, and only pulled up, didn't refuel, we had extra tanks on, and just hung around near the fence. The whole of the town came out to have a look at us. We wondered what had happened, and what had happened, the other lot, when they were landing at Townsville, had a collision. Two aircraft collided, one had landed, and another fellow came in too quickly and ran into him. First fellow was killed, a fellow called Paul Brennan, who'd been in Malta. He had a DFM, DFC, and the other pilot was wounded, injured badly. He was sent home. So that was why we were held up. They had to clear the runway, you see, before we arrived.
The war in the Pacific was a different state of affairs compared to Europe. The Japanese had ceased their daylight air raids, so operations for the eager pilots were confined to mainly air-to-ground attack and escort duty for the bombers.
We were escorting Beauforts up to Jackanow Bay in New Britain and using 90-gallon belly tanks, and the 90-gallon belly tank cut out right over the target, so I switched to the main tanks and nothing happened. Well, it wasn't too nice looking down below with the flak coming up and the bombs going down, but I headed out to sea because we had a course for home, headed out for sea in the gliding, and we were about 26,000 feet at that time. And after I'd got down to about 13,000 feet, I reckon I was far enough away from New Britain that I started to think about bailing out when the motor started again. Well, it coughed and it spluttered, but it kept on going back home, and when I landed and they checked it, there was water in the filter bowl, which had come from sweating drums.
Reinforcements for 79 Squadron were selected once more from Europe and other squadrons. Like many other pilots that had returned home from overseas, Norm Smithill's homecoming was not the one he imagined.
I came back from England in '43 and came back here. I thought we were going to be instructors, and I was not suitable to be an instructor. I told them, they said, "We'll tell you what to do, don't tell us." And so I didn't, but and I went to Mildura, and I will say this, it might be a bit egotistical, but I'd had at that time I think I had something like about 450 hours on the Spit aircraft. But before we could get into these ones, those clapped out fives they had up at Mildura, we had to be checked in a Wirraway. And I've got it in my logbook. I've got 19 hours on the Wirraway, and I got it, had reached the required standard. Then we were taught again how to scramble. So two of us said we'll give them a start and then we'll go. But that didn't create a good impression. But we had the experience on the aeroplane. We knew what we were doing, and. So then they said we're going to do some high flight formation and we could be jumped to give the blokes an idea what it's like to be attacked from the air. And so there were four of us and we happened to be in the one section. And so we saw the jump aircraft coming down and we just waited and waited. We both, two of us went one way and two the other. And he came in between, so then we just rolled over and gave him a thing. And he didn't like being caught on camera. I won't mention his name, but he's a very well-known pilot, senior officer, and but he got used to it and he made marks about our parentage again. So we went to 79 Squadron. It was a cultural shock to some degree because if you're in England, you're dressed as though you're going to the office. But the blokes up there, and it was hot. It was hotter in the aircraft than on the ground because of the heat. And there wasn't an air war as such, but the ground fire that they had up there, the Japs, and they didn't mess around either if they got you. They did all sorts of things, unpleasant.
Another front in which the Spitfire faced the might of the Japanese forces was in Burma. After the invasion of Italy, events saw Earl Filchie posted away from 601 Squadron and into 81 Squadron. It was there that the Spitfire faced an enemy other than the Japanese. Jungles and monsoonal weather were foes that could not be conquered by skill alone. Operational conditions could be described as a jungle siege. If Burma fell, the way to India would be open to the Japanese. They were to be held back by the Allies, with air supremacy gained by the Spitfires. Those on duty faced overwhelming numbers of enemy aircraft. The tactics had to be adapted to use the Spitfire to its full advantage against the more manoeuvrable enemy.
I was involved in a fight with the Japs over there, and I'd done the normal thing. You dive down on them and then you fire and you come back. And I was climbing back up to get some more height, and I saw 4 Yank Mustangs about 10 feet above me. Would look to be that, but they would be a bit more than that. So the first thing I did was I just dived down again. And by the time I'd got out of the way of those Yanks, I started to pull up again, and I think I had that aeroplane doing over 600 miles an hour, which was fantastic for a Spitfire. You're not supposed to dive them over about 450.
Back in England, the preparations for D-Day were well underway. 453 Squadron was an Australian Spitfire squadron selected to provide air support for the invasion force. Seth Parker remembers how those events transpired from the ground crew's point of view on the greatest invasion in history.
While I was there too, order came out one day to paint all the aircraft with black and white stripes. Now this was in April 1944. D-Day was 6th of June. So we painted them all black and white stripes. We didn't know for a start where you had to paint the stripes. So we painted them all black and white stripes. And next day they flew them. They never came up, they hardly saw an aircraft. And they were told if they see any aircraft in the air that's not got black and white stripes on, knock it down.
For reasons unknown to them, the German Luftwaffe did not engage at this time. The pre-invasion test had been a wasted exercise. The big day arrived, and it was a night that those of 453 would never forget. In the squadron diary was written, "We are glad we are not the Germans."
When D-Day came round, I remember that night very well. We were in tents and I heard this aircraft, and I walked out the tent and I said to the mates, "Come and have a look at this." And here was a cloud of planes going over to France, hundreds and hundreds of them. Big Sterling bombers there with 4 gliders behind them, full of troopers. They were going over, and then one of them we saw break loose and it landed on our drone, and we spoke to some of the boys afterwards. But some were disappointed, some were pleased, that they didn't get there. But later on we went up through France. We saw where all these little white crosses on them, and had a look at the names of some of them. A lot of them were killed that very day. I think some were killed before they hit the ground, or when they hit the ground the Germans got them and killed them. And some, of course, were killed in the gliders. They didn't get out, tipped upside down or run into trees and things, got smashed up. But that was a memorable day, that was. See those planes that night coming over.
After the vicious landings and a hard-fought battle, the beachhead had been secured and the invasion penetrated deeper into enemy territory.
We were up on a plateau above where all the sea-borne stuff came in down at Omaha Beach. And when the Germans come in, if they dropped their bombs a bit late from the eastern side, we'd cop it on our drone, And if they come in from the west and dropped them a bit early, we'd cop them again. But the noise at night and all these tracer bullets and that going up, and the pom-pom guns, we had 20 Bofors bombs around our squadron. And when they started off, you could feel the ground shaking, And we didn't get much sleep at all for 6 or 8 weeks there.
The invasion pressed deeper into enemy territory. And after the breakout of Normandy, the Australian squadron was leapfrogged to successive airfields. The pilots faced greater risk, exposing themselves to more enemy fire with each attack. The ground crews were not immune to such danger, as the invasion put everyone in the line of fire, no matter what their trade.
We went to Bapaume and Beauvais and Douai and Lisieux and those places, and then we got bombed out pretty badly there one night in the tents. As I said, we must have seen a light up top, and they dropped a stick of bombs right across the lot of us and took us a few tents. And as soon as they were screaming bombs, but I think they had a sort of a long pin in front of them. And when that pin hit the ground, they exploded. They'd be about this high off the ground, you know. They used to call them daisy cutters or leg cutters, you know. They used to cut the daisy or cut your legs off if they got the... Anyhow, when we heard these coming down, we dived out of the tent and lay flat on the ground. But poor old Merv, the one whose birthday it was, he got this piece of shrapnel through his head and 8 others were badly wounded.
Warrant Officer Merv Watson died on the evening of August the 14th, 1944. He would have been 21 the next day.
You just had to keep going and say to yourself, well, I hope that doesn't happen to me.
Accidents were another hazard of wartime operations, to be endured by pilots and ground crew alike.
We did have quite a few accidents on our strip up in the Darwin area. Within minutes, of course, of something happening, everybody would be running in the direction, and there would be an aircraft, a distressed Spitfire, standing on its nose or on its belly. They failed to activate the landing gear.
The peril experienced during operations and the risk of such accidents meant a sense of humour and mateship were needed to keep these men going in the face of adversity.
What happened today, you get airborne and you get around and here's all the squadrons going like this right at dirt feet. And what that was all about, that up there they had showers that were all up as high as that. And the girls from Porter's mob were all under the showers. And these characters were whizzing around trying to have a dig at them, you know. Yeah, so you remember those sort of things, yeah.
They used to have to pick up their spare aircraft from Charters Towers, where their replacement aircraft, and the ammunition bins of a Spitfire would hold 48 bottles of whiskey. So that's how we managed to keep ourselves going.
That bittersweet occasion, for which all the sacrifice and blood that had been shed arrived in an atomic flash. The war was over. The end had arrived suddenly. The latter stage had looked as if the conflict would drag on for another few years to clean the Japanese forces from the islands. The cessation of hostilities caught many of the servicemen by surprise. When the war finished, there were mixed emotions, as the future suddenly loomed closer.
Well, I happened to be on operations leave in a train travelling down to Melbourne, and a gentleman explained, he said, what do you think about the bomb? And I said, what bomb? I hadn't heard anything because I'd got up much earlier than the news broadcast. I think it came as quite a shock that no one even suspected that there was going to be some fancy bomb that would, of course, as soon as that went off, we thought, well, that's excellent because it's going to save an enormous number of casualties. A lot of people forget about that now, but it may have killed some people, but it probably saved both American and Japanese and Australian and British people, troops, enormous casualties.
I was going to walk home, or I was going to get home, and that's the term of the day I would say, just relief.
I was really anxious to go on with it, yeah. We did some silly things, you know, but drinking inspired us totally. We were going to go and fly for, what's his name, Kai Shek or something, he was still going in China. If the Air Force wouldn't have us, well, we'd go and fight with the Chinese. There, well, but it was a no-no, and yeah. Being a pilot was a good life. Yeah.
It'd be silly to say that you were disappointed that the war had come to the end, but I was a very keen Sprog pilot, and I was very keen to be able to do my stuff, but it didn't happen. So that there was a certain, from my point of view, I was disappointed that I didn't do my bit in the air. But I suppose, generally speaking, everybody had to be relieved.
Oh, I think relief, really, yes, because you've been flying and submitting yourself to enemy action, all sorts of action from the enemy as well. Making a mistake yourself, but no, it was a feeling of relief that the cessation had come about. And for all concerned too, innocent victims, innocent people being killed all throughout the war years.
Well, I was married just before before I left England, but I wasn't married when I came back 3 years later. My wife had gone off with somebody else, so I suppose only natural being away from home for about 3 years. But but one thing I will say, that when I came back, nobody ever wanted you. Even my own parents didn't want me. They sold everything of mine, and I had nowhere to live when I came back, and that's expected.
Well, I was lucky insofar as that I got there late. I had experience of it enough and got out of it. And I reckon that's being lucky, because there's not a great number get out of it.
I was very relieved and happy to think it's all over. There'd be no more boys killed, no more operations, no more bombing and that, and even for the enemy as well as us. No more of it. That was good.
It was a shock, a different life, but I didn't want to fly anymore. No more flying, I'd had enough. And I didn't want to get killed, so that was that.
Well, I was at that stage, I was out here, I was test pilot at Oakey. It didn't sort of hit me very much, I suppose. I think the thing was that after sort of being in the Air Force for about 6 years, what am I going to do? That'll be the first thing, I think. Well, what am I going to do? Stay in the Air Force or get out? I got out eventually, but I would have stayed in only for my wife. She wanted me out, so I said, well, better keep the peace.
The Spitfire will remain with these men forever, whether they flew them or kept them flying. The machine holds a special place for all of them. And while much of the legend may have been propaganda, it is still a pure breed amongst aircraft.
And I remember the first one, Cage 5054, a number which always stuck in my mind, a glossy blue aircraft, sleek in to look at it compared with the biplanes of those days. Oh, it was a lovely aircraft.
You didn't fly it, you put it on, and it wrapped around you and away you went. Oh yes, the Spit was a lady.
And very light on the controls. Treat them like you would your girlfriend.
It was a means to an end. It was a gun platform to start with, but it was a pleasant one to fly.
And you were fully aware you had 2,000 horsepower in your hand, and it took a lot of handling, and you had to be careful with it.
The Spitfire. What became of this machine, this lady of the sky, this guardian of a nation? Her fine lines and pedigree captured the imagination of a generation. The Spitfire came to an unfitting end for her years of service. Relegated to stand in countless fields, to face the wind, rain, scavengers, and the ravages of time. She stood in good company, however, with the likes of the Mustang, Kitty Hawk, and Boomerang. Oakey 6 Aircraft Depot was one of the final resting places for the Spitfire and other notable aircraft. Oakey had serviced and overhauled the aircraft during the war. Official records state that on December the 10th, 1945, over 500 various surplus aircraft were stored on the base. 232 of these were Spitfires. Over the next 2 years, surplus aircraft were disposed of via smelting, scrapping, private sale, and auction. By November 1947, some 553 aircraft had been declared to the Commonwealth Disposal Commission. Mark V A58169, the first Spitfire flown to 79 Squadron by Jeff Wilkinson, met its demise at Oki. The final chapter of the Spitfire had seen the legend reverted to its base material. Who knows, the pots and pans from that time after the war could contain the remnants of a Spitfire. The pilots, guardians of the sky, returned home to become part of society. The ground crew, guardians of the Spitfire, continued their tireless work, this time maintaining modern life rather than a weapon of war. Due to their sacrifices for their country, the nation gives them the title of heroes. What then do these heroes think of this accolade?
Oh, I say no, we just did what we had to do.
Just did my job as I was told to do.
I just ignore it. I mean, it's just nonsense. Just nonsense. You're there to do a job, you joined up to do a job, and that's it.
Well, I know I'm not. I'm not a hero, I'm a rotten shot.
So, well, I slept well.
I just one of the boys.
Just a survivor.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I think I just did my job. And that's it. And I was really surprised that I suddenly got a DFC, but someone reckoned I did all right, so.
The Spitfire was the guardian of a nation. The pilots, guardians of a sacred duty to defend their country. The ground crew were guardians of the Spitfire itself. Together, the legend of the Spitfire was born. And whether it be man or machine that made the legend, we will remember them, lest we forget.